Three, two, one. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest, Vallibus. We talked about a month ago about my most recent film on the smiley face killers phenomenon, the smiley face killers, the global slaughter continues, which is available on Vimeo. And after that show, we were talking about Joe Rogan in some offhand way, like this is kind of an interesting subject of things we've observed. And then after that show, there was the announcement that Joe Rogan signed a huge deal, $100 million deal with Spotify, and is leaving YouTube. And so we were kind of researching. We were trying to get it done last week. I was really busy, but finally today, Friday, it's June 19th. We're going to talk about kind of observations that we've seen. I've got a lot of material. I've kind of been tinkering around, so we did not share notes, but I've got a few things to get started. Unless you want to get going first.
No, thanks again for having me, having this conversation today. It was perfect timing that we were having the offhanded, just tertiary conversation about Joe Rogan, and then he inked this enormous deal, which I recall reading, and I thought, wow, that's huge. I mean, it reminded me of the time Howard Stern signed a $500 million deal with satellite radio.
Right, good point, because I think Joe Rogan is now in that kind of elite group. I think that pretty much solidifies it, yeah.
Yeah, I think he is, sure.
But, I had followed Joe Rogan, and I had seen disturbing deaths in the way that he is asking questions of them, but I had seen a picture like 5 years ago where he's with the grandson of Anton LaVey. Have you ever seen that picture?
I have seen that picture, and I'm glad you brought that up. We have not exchanged notes, so it's kind of funny that you would bring that one up first. I've actually done an extensive amount of research into locating the details surrounding that picture.
Okay, well, tell me what you found.
So, this was, I probably discovered that photo probably about the same time I first really discovered Joe Rogan. I obviously knew who he was, news radio, the Man Show, that kind of thing. I'm not a big UFC person, so was aware that he was the announcer. Past that, I could probably name two fighters at the time, Mm-hmm. So it was interesting when I first started watching some Rogan stuff a few years ago, or listening to his podcast for the first time. And I saw that picture. I was like, well, that's interesting. I looked to see what it was, and I guess he got hired along with his friend Duncan Trussell.
Right.
To do some sort of wedding party, I guess.
Oh, really? Interesting.
A comedy at a wedding. It sounded like it was a comedy show at a wedding party for, it was either the grandson or the granddaughter. But yeah, he's pictured with the grandson of Anton LaVey in that photo. It was one of the two of those individuals was being married that day from the LaVey family.
Fascinating.
And Rogan was there as a performer. That's how the story goes.
Interesting. But he's making like the Cornudo hand sign. He's got a 666 shirt. But he and Duncan Trussell, it's interesting that you bring up Duncan Trussell, because Duncan Trussell was the original producer of the Joe Rogan Experience, right?
Sure.
So they go back, but it's just an interesting fact. Oh, no, it wasn't Duncan Trussell. Sorry, it's Brian Redband. I got him mixed up.
Oh, okay. I know. Yeah, Brian Redband, sure.
But Duncan Trussell is in the news recently because he was in this kind of midnight, what was it called? On the Netflix, he was on some show with Damien Echols, right? The convicted child killer. And Damien Echols is talking with Joey Diaz, who is another friend of Rogan.
Really?
And, yeah.
Wait, so Damien Echols is in the new Duncan Trussell Netflix series?
That's correct.
I had
Midnight Gospel. Yeah.
I'm familiar with the series. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm familiar with it. And I had no idea Damien Echols was in that.
Yeah, talking about magic. So it's pretty fascinating. The convicted child killer is right there with this group. And Duncan Trussell's friends with Rogan. And he's been one of the, like a returned guest, or many featured guest on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah, Duncan Trussell, definitely. He and Rogan are tight. They're close friends. He's definitely been on his podcast a lot. Yeah, there's definitely some close relationships there. And one question for you, relative, since you're an expert and all with the West Memphis 3 business, and I'm vaguely familiar with some of the facts of the case. One of the incidents I read about included Echols and possibly his mother and maybe a sister and a couple other family members being involved in a murder along the river at one point in time?
Correct. So it was actually the same year that he was arrested. So that was 1993. The deaths happened on May 5th, 1993. Jason Baldwin, and Miss Kelly were arrested June 3rd, 1993. And then, like, sometime in November or December, there was a bonfire down by the Mississippi River on the western side of the Mississippi where West Memphis is. Mm-hmm. And there was a shooting, and a guy died, and it involved his mother and his sister, and there was a gun that was, thrown away. But yeah, there was a death, and it involved, I think it was like some kind of weird situation in the family trailer, because the biological father, biological mother, and then the mother's boyfriend or something were living there, and that's the one who got shot. It was super sketchy, and I don't know whatever.
Yeah, it sounded sketchy. Those are the details I recall. Something to that effect, a boyfriend or something like that. Now, a bonfire near the river, was this some sort of ritual event, or was this some sort of domestic type situation?
Well, it gets pretty deep, because you kind of wonder how Eccles became this kind of, person who was in the occult, right? And
Sure.
then you talk to the mother, and the mother never really worked. I think that she was on disability, and the dad, worked at a gas station or something like that, and... in my book, I talk about how she was taking Eccles to go look at books and stuff like that. So she seemed to be interested in helping Eccles procure information and knowledge about the occult. And
that was my take on reading about that as well, that she was involved in it and possibly, raising her son as if that was his religion, as if you would raise a Catholic.
Right.
Or a
Good point.
person.
It seems like it too. And there's there's just a couple things that point to that being the case, because there's a young picture of Eccles in a school yearbook when in the 4th or 5th grade, where somebody writes over it devil worshiper, even that early of an age,
Wow.
So yeah,
That's interesting. And one thing I can tell you about that site along the river where the Eccles incident occurred, that's a mound site.
Interesting.
There's an ancient burial mound site.
Yeah,
location.
what Memphis is kind of has an occult element to it. You can see
Very
the huge pyramid, all kinds of stuff there, right?
Oh yeah, and that pyramid, along with other buildings in that town, are built on mounds.
Yeah, and it's even the name Memphis takes you back to ancient Egypt, right? So
Sure.
that sensibility. Yeah, so there's super sketchy stuff. A lot of stuff that really hasn't been investigated in detail, because people haven't asked the good questions, what's going on. But by the time
why are these things occurring with this kid's life, and why is he continuing to show up on Netflix shows? Why is he a popular person? Why is Damien Eccles so popular amongst folks like Eddie Vedder, right? Isn't he a big supporter?
Yeah, huge.
And
Eddie
Johnny Depp.
Right. And another person who's been on Joe Rogan's show, which is Henry Rollins.
Henry Rollins, fair enough. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, so Henry Rollins was a huge supporter and has been seen, advocating for them and raising money for them. They were at some kind of fall festival or something like that, and all three were on stage, and there's Henry Rollins just chatting it up like they were innocent.
So what is it? Not to get too far off topic, because I think this is in the same wheelhouse as Joe Rogan. Why is Damien Eccles on Joe Rogan's friend's new show, and why do you think he's so popular amongst that crowd, the Rogan, Duncan Trussell crowd, Johnny Depp, Doug
because
Stanhope?
They're all like-minded, right? Because I think they're all like-minded, so he's their kind of totem, right? In my opinion, that was kind of what was exposed to me the longer I researched the West Memphis Three. Who are these people? I didn't really know about their kind of backgrounds and interests and proclivities, but the more I've looked, it's whoa, and so it's interesting, because you and I have talked about the smiley face killers, but there's actually kind of a smiley face theme. It's not a direct central element, but at a kind of a secondary or tertiary thing that surrounds Rogan, because one of his best friends, by his own admission, is Maynard James Keenan from Tool, the band Tool, right?
Sure.
And then that
I'm
drummer,
familiar with Tool. I know they were friends. I don't know to the degree. I guess I've seen him on the show before, maybe.
Yes, definitely on the show. But I think the reason I heard him say something like that was because when Anthony Bourdain died, Keenan called him and said, that was it. And so and I think if I remember correctly, Rogan said something like, "This is one of my best friends," and I don't remember verbatim, but it seemed like they were close friends. But anyway, Keenan,
I could see that from the interactions I've witnessed. I was a Tool fan for years, so I definitely have at least heard a few minutes of a conversation with Joe Rogan and the Tool guy before.
But do you know that he has multiple bands, that he's not even just a Tool member? There's like Pulsifer and a Perfect Circle that he's a singer for.
Yeah, I knew there was Perfect Circle. I'm not familiar with the other act.
Right. So so then the other one is Pulsifer or Pucifer or something like that. Well, there's a direct. So get this. This gets good. So he was in a song called Judith, where they like seriously blaspheme Jesus Christ. Have you ever heard that song?
No, I haven't.
Okay,
no.
Don't listen to it. It's Judith, but guess who the director is? David Fincher, right? Who directed Fight Club. Yeah, no, it gets the circles get very curious. It's like 2 degrees of smiley face. So anyway, there's another video, I can't remember the name of it, with Keenan, where the lead character has a smiley face, right? Mm-hmm. So you see this motif, and then it gets really good. Then Chuck Palahniuk is on the show, right? With some guy who's, I don't know if he's really Palahniuk who wrote Fight Club, but the smiley face symbol is all through the David Fincher film who directed Fight Club, right?
Sure.
And I covered that in my film called Hollywood. So you kind of see like this circle, this web of connections and things like that. And then what I mistook when I was talking earlier, when you said Trussell, I thought you meant Brian Redband, who was kind of Joe Rogan's original producer. If you go back to the original show that started the Joe Rogan Experience, the original producer was Redband, and this guy Jamie is now kind of like was an underling of Redband, is my understanding.
Sure. I could see that, yeah.
Go to Joe Rogan show 1043 with Redband, who's been on the show like 5 or 10 times, and there he is on the show wearing a smiley face bomb on
really?
Yeah,
that's interesting because there is definitely some sort of, as you've identified in a lot of your work, this undertone of the use of the smiley face in occult networks.
Yes,
and it sounds like there is a large volume of occult network style people surrounding Joe Rogan, including the ones we've identified here, and one we haven't mentioned yet, who's close with Damien Eccles as well, apparently, and that's Doug Stanhope, who Joe Rogan refers to as his best friend lots of times.
Right, and I remember we had talked offline about his friends and connections, right? So he's connected to Rogan through the whole comedy circuit, right? But talk a little bit about Stanhope.
So Stanhope and Rogan appear to go back a long ways, and they appear to have the same kind of producer-manager friend at the heart of their work, and that's a fellow by the name of Kevin Booth. You may know him from some pot documentaries I know he's kind of famous for in the alternative community. He's also Alex Jones's producer.
Interesting.
And he's also Bill Hicks' childhood best friend and producer.
Okay.
Now, I don't want to go too far off on a tangent of why I think Bill Hicks is Alex Jones, but Kevin Booth's obviously involved in that conversation, and that's Doug Stanhope and Joe Rogan's guy as well. And I think he's actually been on the Rogan podcast a couple times, at least once.
Okay.
And it's Doug Stanhope that I find most interesting as far as Rogan's friends go, because of his connections with the occult folks.
Right. Like, I've seen pictures of him with Marilyn Manson, right?
Marilyn Manson, Johnny Depp, or Doug Stanhope even says these are his closest friends.
Wow.
And now, if I'm not mistaken, Marilyn Manson and Johnny Depp are both self-proclaimed members of the Process Church.
I didn't know that. Really?
I believe so. I know Manson specifically. I believe Depp also claims to be.
Fascinating. I did not know that. I'm not surprised. Not surprised at all.
I often wonder if there's a connection there with Damien Eccles into that same network.
No, there definitely is. One of the biggest supporters of Eccles financially was Johnny Depp.
Right.
Okay. And that was not as open. I mean, the other one was Peter Jackson Financial, who was mostly bankrolling the whole thing, as getting him out. But Depp and Jackson were really the primary chief financial. And the kind of amount of money they raised was in the millions. It wasn't a joke.
Sure. And, I mean, Johnny Depp, one of the biggest movie stars on the planet at the time, when he's bailing Damien Eccles out.
Absolutely, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So, and have you seen the picture of him kissing, like almost kissing Marilyn Manson? Like they're in some kind of like Love Embrace. Have you seen that?
I actually have not. No.
Okay, that's good. I'm glad you haven't, because it's pretty disturbing. But no, they're friends. I mean,
they all seem very tight. If I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
that whole crew right there. Maybe Stanhope. I feel like maybe, but definitely Eccles, Manson, and Depp. They all have the same tattoos together.
Right. So there's a famous tattoo guy whose name escapes me on Sunset, and they went and got this tattoo of the I Ching together. And I forgot which form it was, like 19 or Air Over Water was something like that. But they both have it on their forearm. There's a picture of them with this kind of famous tattoo artist with that same, they have multiple. And Eccles is kind of has tagged people with this style of Theban alphabet tattoo, which is a circle, and inside is the kind of a sigil. So it's this idea, but he's actually given one to Depp. Depp has one, Peter Jackson has one, Eccles has a number of them, but actually you can see pictures of Kenneth Anger, who goes back to kind of Crowley, actually.
Sure.
If you read Children of the Beast, my book, like, he has that same tattoo, so the same style of tattoo goes back. And the Theban alphabet is the witch's alphabet, right? So that's the witch's language. So it's
interesting. Those are some interesting connections right there.
Yeah, no, because the interesting thing. So, like, when I first started researching the West Memphis 3, I got into it because Crowley was mentioned at court, but I didn't really know these celebrities. I didn't know really much about Depp. I didn't know much about Margaret Cho or Henry Rollins. But once you really start researching these people, man.
Yeah, I agree with you, William. Those are some good points. I'm familiar with Margaret Cho. I've never heard of her occult undertones or dealings. What exactly is that?
Well, she was a supporter. She's went and visited Eccles and was like one of the Hollywood supporters too.
Okay.
There was a bunch. There was some names who I can't remember too. But the Dixie Chicks. Better. Right. Yeah, a lot of people you'd be surprised, but a lot of people were supportive. But Margaret Cho, I was told, and I actually saw this, she was on getting coffee. What's the comedian he drives around in a car getting coffee with Seinfeld? And she's like talking to Seinfeld about this guy Genesis P. Orridge, who just died this year. But he was a big time cultist, like a literal yeah.
And she's referring to Peorage in a favorable fashion.
Yes, like, have you heard about this guy? Like, trying to turn him on to Orridge. And Eccles was with the Orridge. So, like, Eccles has tons of connections with these guys. And now, I was surprised about Stanhope. I did not know Stanhope was friends with Manson and Depp.
Oh, yeah, very tight.
Wow.
Johnny Depp wrote the foreword to his autobiography, to Stanhope's, just a few years ago.
I didn't know that.
And I don't watch it. I don't familiarize myself with a lot of Joe Rogan shows, but the ones I have watched and the things I have seen, one thing off the top of my head, they did a 2016 presidential election show at the Comedy Store, actually. A live show they broadcast there. A bunch of the comedians, Bill Burr, Bert Kreischer, who's one of my favorite comedians, and so that's one of the reasons I was watching it. And Doug Stanhope's there, and sure enough, they're trying to convince him to drag Marilyn Manson out from backstage, who was hanging out with Stanhope there.
Interesting.
So I mean, they're very tight. They're oftentimes together, and one of the times that I had heard Joe Rogan referencing something that caught my attention in a show one time, and I'm still scouring. I told you about this because I definitely heard it, and I've been trying to recently locate the clip, and it was Joe Rogan saying that his friend Doug owns a farm in Casanova, Michigan. And I immediately sprung up because obviously Casanova, Michigan is the site of the Todd Guy murder and the Smiley Face killing.
Right. One of the original ones.
One of the original ones. It happened. Todd Guy lived on a mound complex there in rural Michigan, nowhere near anything else really. After reading the initial Smiley Face Killer's book, in my mind, much like I felt that Todd Guy was associated with the people that killed him. Maybe they were trying to recruit him into the network or something like that.
Right, it's like the Tommy Booth thing, right? The Tommy Booth.
Yeah, exactly, like Tommy Booth, correct. Yeah, so, according to the Drowning in Forensic Studies book, the detectives identified that there was a network of cocaine dealers out of Lansing, Michigan, about an hour south, that that were at that party and had a beef with Todd Geib over an undisclosed reason.
Right. For people who don't know, Geib was found in a lake in a very strange way. Like half of his body was out of the lake. It had been searched before. And then somebody...
21 days. Wasn't he missing almost 21 days? Yeah,
missing a long time, right? And then on his gravestone, they put a smiley face, right, if I remember correct. And then people were getting harassed, like people were driving by. People who were researching were getting sketched out. And there were other murders in that area, too. There's a lot.
A lot of unsolved murders in that area.
Yeah, tons. If you talk to Jim Smith, man, he's got the whole Western Michigan is just lit up with all kinds of strange deaths. And there was a famous kind of, I can't remember his name offhand, but he was one of the best B-level college quarterbacks in the country. He ended up dead, Western Michigan, under very sketchy circumstances, being chased by somebody in the woods. It was,
sure.
These connections.
It seems interesting, the connection, when I heard that there's individuals that may in fact be members of the Process Church that are located may own farmland in Casanova, Michigan.
Wow, that's incredible.
Which again is the middle of nowhere.
It's the middle of nowhere, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
Western Michigan, is my understanding, isn't very populated, right?
No, I've driven through that region numerous times. There's not much there. Wow. If you make it all the way up to Traverse City on the, kind of on the northern corner there on the western side on the lake, that's a nice town. Not much in between.
Wow, that's incredible.
The Air Force maintains a gun range up there, not far from there. That's how I know that no one lives up there, because I've been to the gun range plenty of times. And it's pretty vacant up through there. So to find someone like Joe Rogan having a friend saying that, that friend being Doug, but likely Doug Stanhope, the way he references it, owning a farm in that town, seems quite coincidental and, grounds for further research, in my opinion.
Right, I agree with you, but I think it's also interesting because it provides insight on how there's so much silence about Eccles from Hollywood, because nobody wants to speak out because their friend was involved in getting him out, or their friend's friend, right? So this kind of social group is you hear almost total silence. And that was one of the great mysteries of the true story of the West Memphis Street, not the propaganda or the public media or the spin, is the true story. Is like, why isn't anybody saying anything? It's because all these people in Hollywood know somebody else who was a big time supporter. They want to make them look bad, or they don't want to expose it, or whatever.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, and I think along those same lines, I think there's been a culture of Hollywood that's been cultivated to the point where if you're not into something that would be considered abnormal by the middle America, then you're not part of the club. And the stranger the fetish or activity is, the more you're part of the club. That's almost the culture they've created, because when an executive at one of the largest talent agencies murders the guy in his basement in the sex dungeon, and no one bats an eye, and the guy's back at work on Monday like he just got into a car accident on the weekend or something,
Right. No, that's so strange. It's just so true, though. And that's kind of like to me, that's kind of like the glass ceiling of Hollywood, is like, if you aren't willing to go that route, you're just not going to get up to the higher echelons of that. Because all these guys are involved in all kinds of pedophilia, BDSM, crazy gay parties. It's just really.
It almost seems like a qualifying factor, though, right? Like, if you're not into that, you're definitely not going to get anywhere there. It seems like that's their culture. If you're not going to adapt to their culture, then you're not going to be in it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that there's a lot of truth to that. So people, watch out. If you think you want to go make it in Hollywood, be careful, because that place has chewed up all these kinds of innocent lives of people, and people who who weren't properly disillusioned before they got to Hollywood, and just they got chewed up and spit out.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think anyone cares to ever talk about any of these activities there. Not necessarily, obviously, relative to Joe Rogan here, but there was an incident just a few months ago. I read a report from if you recall, the NBC show To Catch a Predator.
Yes.
So that ran for a number of years. It was, Chris Hansen, a very popular show. One of the early seasons, they used a young girl as the actress. She was in her 20s. She was playing a 14-year-old or something. So, as the bait, she was an actress they used as the bait. And she said that they caught a Nickelodeon producer in the sting.
Wow.
Yeah. I read that in a report that she gave. That's her statement.
But they never showed it on the TV, though.
They never showed it on. Not only did they never show it on the TV, I've scoured the records of the date that she gave for when this occurred, and there's no criminal charges, no news reports, nothing.
And now Nickelodeon has, Crazy Days and Nights have talked about all of these producers at Nickelodeon who were just outright pedophiles, sexual abuser, women and boys and stuff. What was the guy's name? I forgot his name.
Dan Schneider.
Schneider's
one of the worst. Yeah, I suspect it's probably Dan Schneider that got picked up in the sting.
Wow, that's incredible.
Because if you look at Dan Schneider's alleged his alleged targets of his assaults, it's young women around that same age.
14, 13-year-old girls.
Yep. And that's exactly what the girl was playing, a 14-year-old girl, the actress was that day, who worked for the PI agency that was in charge of that operation. So the police aren't. That's what I'm saying. The police aren't immediately involved, especially in the early seasons of that show. It was a private detective agency running these sting operations. And quite honestly, I don't think anyone really complained because they're rolling up pedophiles, but at the same time, like, some of their operations were clearly questionable, and they actually got a couple of them. There was things that I don't think there were so much charges were dropped, but I think there was more so plea deals from prosecutors on the back end on a couple incidents. One guy who was actually a prosecutor who got busted in the show, and they did show this one, I believe, at least a portion of it. He was a guy out of, I think, Dallas, Texas. He was a county prosecutor. He committed suicide.
Wow.
The cops, because he went back to his house and barricaded himself. They showed a portion of the incident, not the suicide, the portion of the incident with the guy who I think made the actual TV show. The guy committed suicide later and the family sued. So I think that was one of the things that kind of shut that show down. There was some other questionable activities going on, but what I'm getting at was the police weren't immediately involved. So if Dan Schneider got caught up in that incident, Nickelodeon could have been there with one of their fixers paying everybody off within an hour, probably.
Well, good point, because I've heard that that's one of the reasons why a lot of the information about what was going on at the Nickelodeon set didn't get out, is that the fixers were there, signing agreements, paying people off, all kinds, because the exposure was in the millions. But Nickelodeon, those shows were cash cows, super cheap to make.
I was going to say, Dan Schneider's hundreds of millions. He's worth way more than Bill Cosby, I think.
Wow.
If you really think about it. If you think about Bill Cosby, when he went down, that show was on 100-some nations. They were playing on syndication, The Cosby Show. That was just one of his shows, because he had other shows that were being played as well, Fat Albert, all that stuff. But The Cosby Show itself, it caused some of the actors on that show who weren't in other programs, because they acted on there for a decade, and they were relying on the royalties from that show to sustain their life on. They had to go find new work. One of the guys became a grocery cashier.
I heard about that. Wasn't he end up at Trader Joe's or something like that?
So, one of those places.
Yeah,
so and that guy acted on a few things after the show, but clearly he was relying on that Cosby money. And you look at shows like Dan Schneider, and Dan Schneider has produced every hit TV show from Nickelodeon from like 1995 to 2015.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, let's segue that back to Rogan, because he has had very unfortunate or disturbing connections to probably the biggest story before the whole COVID thing or the impeachment, which was Jeffrey Epstein, right? So he has had on his show Lawrence Krauss and Steven Pinker, two materialist Darwinian scientists who were friends with Epstein and were at the Edge Group in Monterey, pictured with Epstein together, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and, I think Epstein funded some of Krauss's research down there at the University of Arizona. He's at Arizona State, astrophysicist, right?
Right, yeah. So I think he was involved in that. And there was some kind of weird Santa Fe foundation in Santa Fe. Some of these guys were around the same ideas, Darwinian evolution, materialism. And it was very odd to have him on, but I think the most recent one, which is post-Epstein thing, was he had this guy, and I think we talked about it last month, was this guy Adam Perry Lang, who was
you told
Epstein's
me about
chef.
that guy.
Yeah. And Virginia Giuffre actually mentions him by name. I think she calls him Adam, working at the Manhattan, blackmail mansion, right? In Manhattan, and here he is talking to Rogan, and Rogan doesn't ask him any questions about Epstein. So it's almost like a cover. You know, like,
oh, absolutely. Well, you told me about that. That's exactly what I thought, because I went and looked at the details, and I'm like, well, they're just clearly covering this up. It's just adding a layer of confusion that he would never ask any questions about Epstein to this guy.
Yeah, like no connection, no nothing. You're in L.A. He's very specific about where he works next to the Pantages Theater. He's just a meat guy. Yeah,
right?
It's very. I mean, if you know that, it's just like some of these other things.
Yeah, he was the aged
steak guy. Yeah, I've been, you know, Rogan's talking about being there, and it's like the whole other part of the story where this guy was serving these people. Also, Ghislaine Maxwell. It's like this is still. I mean, the Epstein thing is still going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it has to be intentional, right? I mean, there's no way that's accidental.
So. Yeah, and I mean, I think that goes back to even the conversation that Rogan had with Duncan Trussell when they were talking about Midnight Gospel and Damian Eccles. I kind of felt like they were volleying tennis balls back at each other easily, you know, where they had kind of a pretext or a pre-scripted kind of way that they were going to talk about it. Never bringing up the West Memphis 3, never bringing up, you know, the death of this, and just totally shaping this whole narrative. And I think that should be a concern to people who listen to Rogan. At least that side of Rogan.
Oh yeah,
yeah. I don't do I don't listen to the fighting or the whatever those shows are. The you know, I'm not really interested in that side of his show. The shows that I do listen to are more cultural or the intellectuals that are on there. But you can't. I mean, he has so many shows.
I've definitely enjoyed a Joe Rogan conversation a time or two, and I've definitely laughed at some of his jokes, but he definitely has some questionable relationships. And when he's having on Epstein's chef and there's not a single mention of Epstein, that's to me that's intentional. That's got to be, in my mind, that's got to be very much just to add some sort of cover layer to things. And I see it going on in other places. I see it going on right now relative to the George Floyd situation. I'm not sure. I don't want to get too far off topic, but giving a relative comparison. So George Floyd, the fellow that got murdered allegedly there in Minnesota by the video everybody around the world saw. Not to get into the details of the video, but George Floyd was a gangster rapper from Houston. That's who the guy was. There was another gangster rapper in the light of this man's death that said, "I'm going to go to Minnesota from Houston and riot and loot," and he was inciting a lot of those activities. That man was doing media events with a fellow gangster rapper from the same rap label in Houston was doing media events with a congresswoman talking about, you know, all the incidents, etc. And he's doing media events saying he's going to Minnesota. He's going to Minnesota and doing media events. And none of these media events does anyone ever say, "Do you know this guy, George Floyd?" They're making it sound like he's just some kind of activist guy from Houston. No one puts two and two together that they're rappers from the same label that have actually.
Do you know what the name of their label? Do you know the name of their label?
Yeah, it's the major label out of Houston. I'm not a big rap fan. Yeah, it's DJ Screw. I know is the original founder of the label. I think it's called Screw Records, maybe something to that effect.
Did Floyd, was he under the same name? Did he rap under his own name?
He rapped under Big Floyd, and he definitely rapped with this guy that I'm talking about. The guy I'm talking about is Trey the Truth, Trae the Truth. And you can watch the guy do videos. You can watch him with a congresswoman doing media.
Which congresswoman is it?
The one from Houston, the super crazy lady, Sheila Jackson Lee.
Oh yeah, with the hat or whatever.
Yeah, they all get a little aggressive down in that region with their cowboy hats, I think.
Wow. See, yeah, that whole story's shaped. I mean, the thing is they never talk about Floyd as like a repeat criminal who did a home invasion. And she punched some woman in the stomach, and
on
the day that he was arrested, he was on fentanyl and meth. They found fentanyl, and if you watch the video, he's clearly dropped a bag of white powder, so he was on something, and it doesn't make what happened to him right, but I feel like
the whole situation, it does seem very scripted. They blew it all into this white cop who worked with this guy and may have had beefs in this club they worked in. They shaped it all around this thing, right? He may have worked at that club. I don't know for a fact that he didn't. That club burnt down immediately into the riots. I have a lot of questions into the activities of that club and its ownership. However, there's a club
you're not alone. You're not alone, because a lot of people also do,
Yeah, there's some definitely questionable things going on there. But across the town in Minneapolis, that one sits in like little Somalia region on the eastern side of town. On the western side of town is more of the white populated region and Spanish populated region as well. And there's a club over there that claims that George Floyd not only worked there as their bouncer, but lived there. The owner is spinning the same tale as the other owner of the other club, saying, oh, this guy was a great guy. He protected us. He protected our building, et cetera, et cetera. That story, I actually believe that dude actually lived and worked there because he has no registered address in Minnesota from like what I can tell.
Wow.
And so if he's a felon from Houston who got off probation in 2012, moved to Minneapolis in 2014 to work as a bouncer and live at this club, and they probably pay him in cash, yeah, I believe all of that.
Right.
You know, but that's not the story being spun by the media. The story by the media is he worked at this different club.
Interesting.
Now,
right.
The club
but it would make sense for him to do something like that where he doesn't really have a set address as an ex-felon where he's trying to clean up his past.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, that's a felon class lifestyle, to not have your address, to get paid in cash, to live at a place of your employment. Sure. These are all things that I would reasonably expect from somebody who's just off of felony probation for, like you said, a home invasion where he put a gun onto a pregnant woman's belly, apparently.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that, I think it's possible that the guy did work up there, but why he's being spun into this other person, into this other club, I think is a different story. Now, the club on the west side of town that's not being heavily pushed in the media, but there are media reports, and again, from like the major media of Minneapolis too, the major newspaper outlet has done multiple stories on the subject from the other club. They don't ever mention the two clubs in the same story, though.
Right.
And
interesting.
The other club identifies and has thrown parties for George Floyd as being Big Floyd the rapper.
Fascinating.
And no one on the other side of the other club that burnt down recognizes that he was that rapper. It's a very strange dichotomy being built, but I think it kind of speaks to the structured nature of a lot of things that go on TV, that whether it's the George Floyd incident, whether it's Duncan Trussell tossing softballs to Damien Eccles on a Netflix show. You know, I think these are all well-structured events of media.
Well, I think that they're just structuring everything, to be honest with you. So I think that this is just another example of the same, you know, whatever their agenda, motivation is. Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, Floyd. I mean, objectively, was he wasn't a choir boy.
No, absolutely. But I think, what's the outcome of the situation? The outcome has been chaos, right?
Oh, just terrible outcome.
Yeah.
Terrible outcome. Hundreds of millions of dollars in damages, permanent economic effects. I was just in Santa Monica yesterday, in downtown Santa Monica. It looked like a war zone. Like the block, I was surprised at how bad it was because things were boarded up, and some of those things that were boarded up are not coming back. There was actually a sign on one of these streets. I think it was Santa Monica and 5th Street. There was a formerly thriving restaurant and business there, and it just said it was boarded up, and I think it said building empty. Like I would never expect to see that sign like that. And also, you know, because of COVID and everything else, it was the place that was formerly an economic hive of activity was just 10% or 20% of what it used to be.
Yeah, that's wild. I was actually just in Santa Monica last March, so I do recall it being very busy too. So I could only imagine what it looks like today.
No, it's incredible. I should have taken a video and just let people see the damage because I was surprised at how many things were boarded up. And, you know, I just think that the way it was extrapolated, the way it was shaped, like you said, is like all cops are bad, which is not even close to the truth. Not even close.
Right.
I mean, I don't know who the Chauvin guy was. I mean, from what I read, they knew each other. So they might have had a beef. You know, they might have had some personal beef. They knew each other and worked together.
If they did, true, absolutely. And I think that, but I also think that could just be part of the narrative.
Well, it's we get into a deeper level. I don't know
right.
how that will be proved, but if it's a fake backstory,
that's what I'm saying. There's two different backstories. So the backstory that he worked with the guy is one being spun, but there's another one being spun in the media that actually has valid facts behind it.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's an odd situation all around. But I think again that chaos was achieved, and that was the goal. And I think organizations exist. It may sound crazy to some folks, but I'm sure, as you know, organizations much like the Process Church, they're one of their primary orders, it seems, is to create chaos.
Oh, I don't think that. I mean, especially back in the '60s and '70s, I think that they thought the world was going to end, and they were very nihilistic, you know, and all of their sensibilities, and they were very intelligent people too. At least the guys who were at the very top of it. A very small group too. The Process Church, according to people, was like 100, 200 people, but you know, if you're intelligent, you got it, and you're a tight organization model on the Jesuits. You know, it's basically like the SS or something.
Yeah, and they're an offshoot of Scientology,
right?
And which is an offshoot of Thelema, correct?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, so, I think that all of these offshoots of the Crowley offshoots of Thelema are oftentimes taking care of each other.
Oh, I've heard the same thing. I've heard that Scientology was trying to recruit from the Process, and likewise. And if you really look at some of these other guys, an interesting point. There was a Joe Rogan show. I wish I could remember it, but he referenced Robert Anton Wilson, like somebody who knew Robert Anton Wilson's writing. And Robert Anton Wilson, for people who don't know, wrote the Illuminatus trilogy and all stuff. But Joe Rogan said something like, I wish I could remember it verbatim, but he said, President Johnson was the intellect president because he was so dumb, everybody really appreciated education. So it was like a paradox. It was the opposite. He had the opposite effect. But he quoted Robert Anton Wilson from memory. Rogan did.
Interesting.
And so. But my
from
point
listening to his friend Duncan Trussell, it seems like he's probably the influence of Robert Anton Wilson on Rogan.
Right. But so here's the other true. But here's the other thing is that Anton Wilson. My point is that Wilson joined almost everything he could, just like Crowley. So a lot of these groups, they may have members, but they may be members of other groups. Like, so Robert Anton Wilson was a member of the OTO. He made jokes about that. He hung out with other people. He hung out with Rick Murtry. So these Satanists, you know.
Oh, that's a good point. And
yeah,
there's definitely an extensive network there with McMurtry and everybody else there.
Yeah. Oh, no, man. And, I mean, there's pictures of Robert Anton Wilson together, him and Leary, who was carrying on Crowley's thing. So...
Yeah, I think that these organizations do. They work at, that's how their network operates. They are maybe Scientologists. Yes, they are maybe Process, but ultimately speaking, they're all Thelemites.
I think you're right. I think it's the same ideology.
Yeah, I see it in NXIVM. I see the precise philosophical undertones of NXIVM as being an offshoot of Scientology, even. And some of the early people
there's no question
from Scientology.
There's no question that it's an offshoot of Scientology. A lot of the structures and all that stuff.
Yeah, the teachings, the structures, everything. They even argued in court when faced with child sex trafficking charges in a federal court. They argued Scientology's been doing it for years. Why aren't you prosecuting them?
Really, I didn't know that. That's
yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, well, it seems it was somewhat rooted in the child farms that both of these organizations somewhat produce to a degree. Maybe not all kids involved, but if you have some groups of the cult, if they have a child, they get sent off to these farms.
So the NXIVM had their original when he was arrested. When what's his face was arrested, I wish I could remember his name. It was the fact that he was a pedophile having sex with underage 14-year-old girls, right? And the same thing was going on with Epstein. And the totality of Epstein's crime, and that's what's disgusting about covering this stuff up, is that they were trading in kids that nobody ever saw. And even Farmer, who was one of the original victims from the early 90s, said she saw kids there and they just were never seen again. Nobody knows where the hell they're from. They were from like Venezuela or something like that, or and
I think the Farmer sisters. I think that's here near me in Ohio. Actually,
yeah,
that's up there in Albany. It's about 2 hours from me, and. I believe they referenced that they saw thousands of girls just in a short period of time.
They were talking about freaking industrial levels of trafficking, just not like one at a time. And that's the whole story that came out of Florida too, and probably came out of New York. But like you just hear these stories of people coming and going, and so the cover up. But
how far is Epstein really disconnected from the same network of these these same cult network folks? Because NXIVM and Epstein are very close politically with their people that are involved.
Yes.
And I mean Clinton's predominantly, because Bill Clinton's best friend and former guy that he appointed as the chief of the Arkansas Supreme Court after he appointed Hillary's law partner to that position previously, the one that they took to D.C., Webster Hubbell.
Hubbell.
Yeah. So he was the first guy that Clinton had appointed to the Arkansas Supreme Court, and that guy went to prison not too long after that. You know, they took him to D.C. and they tried to make him the Attorney General, and you might recall, this is probably from more your time than my time in D.C., that the Clintons try to make Webster Hubbell, Hillary's law partner, the Attorney General, and Congress sent him to prison instead.
Yes, that's right. I remember that. Yeah.
That's Bill did not pardon him. Bill never gave him a pardon.
That's the actual original, supposedly the true father of Chelsea. Have you heard that?
Oh, I 100% believe it. Look at a picture. I mean, she looks just like him. If you look at his daughter and Chelsea, they would pass off as sisters.
No, you're right. Yeah, I believe
so the next guy that Clinton appointed to the Arkansas Supreme Court, his name's escaping me. He was NXIVM's chief counsel for years.
Get out of town. I did not know that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And these are all intel fronts, too. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. Blackmail. They're just really dark lurks. And if you look at Scientology, it was the same type of thing. Occult, trading, drugs. L. Ron Hubbard's son said Hubbard was trading in drugs. It's 2 on his boats. I mean,
I wouldn't be surprised.
Just incredible.
It's a great cover, right? I mean, you have a religious vessel. Who's gonna port it?
Absolutely. We're a church, right?
Yeah.
So
it's the same thing I say about the Tiger Show on Netflix. Of course, the Tiger people were shipping drugs with their tigers. That's why they put the main logistics guy of all the Tiger shipments. That's why he's the one in prison right now.
Wow.
Tiger, the Oklahoma fellow, the gay tiger guy.
Yeah, right. That's
one of the things
Joe Exotic, right?
Yeah, Joe Exotic. One of the things the feds were after were his shipping notices, all of his shipping orders and whatnot. And one of the people involved in there was one of the characters behind the character of Scarface. So that guy definitely is involved in drug trafficking.
And he killed somebody too, right? Didn't he say he was wanted or shot somebody or manslaughter?
Yeah, he's one of the characters for Scarface, the Cuban fella in the Gay Tiger Show on Netflix. And the feds are after the shipping notices for what I allege is because there's drugs in all those shipments. Right. Because who's going to search a shipment of tigers for drugs? Oh, no, your tigers are good. I don't want to get eaten while looking for your drugs today. So I think that's a good indication. Also, just there's another network right there, just off the top of my head, that literally operated for decades. There's 20 other tiger farms that were not included in that Netflix show that are part of the same investigation because they were too smart. They were smart enough to say, "Oh, I don't want you to film me."
Right. They didn't want the exposure, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, we are coming up on 50 minutes. Is there anything you'd like to kind of end this discussion with, or anything you'd like to add?
No, I think it's a great conversation. I appreciate the opportunity. William Ramsey's wonderful talking to you once again here.
Likewise, man. Likewise.
And it's an interesting conversation on a character like Joe Rogan, who, I think is, in many regards, is kind of invented the podcast world that we're currently talking on, but at the same time has clearly entered into different ventures over time, because you can see I look at his venture into the podcasting world as a whole and see him kind of framing conversations along the way, almost like taking folks along for a ride.
Totally agree.
The moon landing would be a great example. His whole approach to that, or the lack thereof.
Very well said. Very well said. We will finish it with that. So it's Vallibus. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yep. William Ramsey, I appreciate it, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, take care.